Mabel always caught the attention of the people in Pine Creek, even when she wore her oldest gray sweaters and boots that had seen too many winters. There was a quiet strength in the way she walked through the small Maine town, carrying heavy baskets of laundry down to the cold river. Her brown hair fell in loose waves over her shoulders, catching the pale sunlight that filtered through the tall pine trees each afternoon. Her eyes showed a mixture of kindness and a deep, quiet stillness, like someone who had learned too early that life could change in a single day. People whispered that Mabel could have been the happiest girl in the valley if her family had stayed whole. But the cold winters of North never asked for permission before changing things forever. When Mabel turned 15 years old, a sudden blizzard took her father away on the mountain road. He had stayed behind to help Ahada Strandpot pull a wagon out of a freezing creek. But the rising water took him before he could reach the shore. Mabel's mother never truly recovered from that winter night. She spent her days sitting by the small wood stove, watching the snow fall against the glass until her own health faded away just 2 years later. After the small funeral, the neighbors stopped by for a few days to leave bowls of warm soup, thick blankets, and pieces of dry bread. But as the months passed, everyone returned to their own busy lives. Mabel had to learn how to take care of herself in the small cottage at the edge of the woods. She washed clothes for the wealthy families near the town square, helped the local grocer stack heavy bags of flour during the harvest, and took on any small job that paid a few coins or a basket of vegetables. Many nights she went to sleep with an empty stomach, telling herself she was not hungry so she could save a small crust of bread for the next morning. Despite the hard work and the cold nights, Mabel never lost her gentle ways. Even when her hands were sore from the freezing river water, she always brushed her hair with care and tied it back with a clean piece of twine. She fixed the tears in her old dresses with neat, tiny stitches, trying her best to look presentable when she walked into town. She used a small bar of lavender soap that her mother had left behind, keeping the scent on her skin because it reminded her of better days. It was exactly this quiet care that made some of the local girls angry, because Mabel remained beautiful without trying. She had a natural grace that did not require expensive jewelry, heavy makeup, or dresses brought from the big cities, and that made people look at her whenever she walked down the main street. Blair was the daughter of the wealthiest merchant in Pine Creek, and she could not stand the way people looked at Mabel. Blair grew up in a large white house with 3 chimneys, wore silk ribbons in her hair, and went to every social gathering in the county. She made sure to look down on anyone who did not have money, often making quiet, sharp remarks to her friends whenever a working girl passed by. But every time Mabel came into the town square to deliver clean sheets, Blair noticed the shift in the room. The older shopkeepers would offer Mabel a free apple, and the young men would stop their work just to watch her pass. It burned Blair to think that a girl who lived in a drafty cottage with no family name could draw more eyes than someone with a large inheritance. Because of this, Blair never missed a chance to make Mabel feel small in front of others. She would walk past Mabel with her friends, holding a silk handkerchief to her nose, as if the smell of honest work was too much to bear. She often made comments about how sad it was to see someone beautiful wearing rags, offering her old, stained aprons with a fake smile that never reached her eyes. Her friends always laughed, and Mabel would simply lower her eyes and keep walking, carrying her heavy baskets. Mabel knew that in a town like Pine Creek, money spoke louder than a good heart, and she had no time to waste on arguments when she needed to earn her bread. On the highest hill overlooking Pine Creek sat the Crestmont estate. It was a massive property surrounded by thick stone walls, dark iron gates, and miles of private forest that the townspeople avoided. The estate had belonged to the same family for generations, but the current master was a mystery to everyone in the valley. His name was Caspian, and the rumors about him were endless. Some said he was a foreign nobleman who hated the sun, while others whispered that he belonged to an ancient line of rulers who stayed hidden from the modern world. The town elders knew him as the Vampire King, a man who did not age, whose skin was as pale as marble, and whose hair was as white as winter frost. He lived in the shadows of the great house, ruling his vast lands with absolute silence. Caspian rarely came down to the town, leaving the business affairs to his older human estate manager, a stern man named Garrison. The only time the town truly felt the presence of Crestmont was during the annual Autumn Festival. Every October, the gates of the estate would open for one night, and the entire town would gather in the grand courtyard for a celebration. There would be hot cider, roasted meats, and musicians playing old folk songs under the stars. The most important part of the night was the traditional opening dance. Caspian would appear on the stone terrace, walk down into the crowd, and choose one young woman from the valley to start the dance. For the local families, being chosen meant wealth and favor for the coming year. Blair had spent 3 months preparing for this specific night, buying a bright red gown from a tailor in the city. She talked about the dance constantly, telling everyone that Caspian would finally see who truly belonged at the top of Pine Creek society. She spent hours in front of her mirror, practicing her smile and her posture, confident that her wealth and beauty would outshine every other girl in the valley. To Blair, the festival was not a celebration of the harvest, but a stage where she would finally take her place beside the mysterious master of the hill. She could not imagine a world where he would look at anyone else. 3 days before the autumn festival, the autumn wind grew sharper, shaking the last yellow leaves from the birch trees. Mabel was down by the river, kneeling on a flat stone and scrubbing a pile of heavy linen sheets for the local inn. Her fingers were red from the cold water, and she had to pause every few minutes to blow on her hands to keep them moving. She heard the sound of light footsteps and giggles coming down the dirt path before she saw the shadows on the grass. She did not need to turn around to know who it was, but she kept working, focusing on the rough fabric in her hands. "Are you planning to wash clothes through the whole winter, Mabel?" Blair asked, standing at the edge of the bank with 3 of her friends. They were all wearing thick wool cloaks with shiny silver buttons, holding small baskets of sweet pastries they had just bought from the bakery. Mabel stopped scrubbing, wiped her wet hands on her apron, and looked up with a calm expression. "The work needs to be done," she replied softly. Blair stepped closer, her leather shoes crunching on the dry pebbles, a small, unkind smile on her lips. "The autumn festival is this weekend. Surely you are taking a break to attend the dance." Mabel looked down at her reflection in the moving water, then back at Blair. "I have a lot of orders to finish by Monday. I do not think I will have the time." Blair exchanged a quick look with the girl beside her, her smile growing wider. "Oh, but you must come. Everyone is saying that the Master of Crestmont is looking for someone special this year. It would be a shame if you missed your chance to see how the other half lives." The other girls covered their mouths to hide their laughter, their eyes moving down to Mabel's patched boots and the frayed hem of her skirt. Mabel felt a familiar heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady and polite. "I do not have the proper clothing for a gathering at the estate." Blair leaned in slightly, pretending to offer comfort. "Do not worry about that. A pretty girl like you looks fine in anything. Who knows, maybe the Vampire King will appreciate a more rustic look." One of the girls laughed out loud, pointing at the soap suds on Mabel's arms. Imagine her trying to dance in those heavy work boots. She would tear the master's shoes apart. They turned and walked back toward the town square, their laughter fading into the wind as they disappeared behind the trees. Mabel stood alone by the river for a long time, watching the soapy water drift away. She looked at her rough palms, the small scars from wood splinters, and the ache in her shoulders. She carried the heavy basket back to her small cottage, the silence of the empty rooms greeting her as she pushed the heavy wooden door open. The house was cold, so she built a small fire with 3 pieces of birch wood and sat down on the low stool by the window. In the corner of the room, inside an old pine chest, lay the only valuable thing her mother had left behind. It was a simple light blue dress made of soft cotton, with white lace around the collar that had yellowed slightly with age. Mabel lifted the dress with care, holding it against herself as she looked into the small, cracked mirror on the wall. The fabric was thin, and the color had faded from too many washings, but it was clean and smelled faintly of the lavender soap. She touched the smooth lace, remembering how her mother used to wear it on Sunday mornings when the family would walk into town together. For a few minutes, Mabel allowed herself to wonder what it would be like to walk into a grand ballroom without feeling the sting of judgment. She imagined stepping across a polished floor where people did not look at her with pity or amusement, but with simple kindness. She pictured a night where she could forget the stack of laundry, the leaky roof, and the worry of how many logs were left in the woodshed. She shook her head, folding the blue dress carefully and placing it back into the chest, reminding herself that dreams did not pay for flour or firewood in Pine Creek. That night, before she went to bed at 9 o'clock, Mabel changed her mind. She walked over to the local seamstress's shop, using 2 silver coins she had saved to buy a small yard of plain blue ribbon. When she returned to the cottage, she sat by the dim light of a single candle and sewed the ribbon along the worn edges of her mother's dress, covering the tiny holes where the fabric had grown thin. She worked until her eyes were tired, finishing the last knot just as the wind began to howl through the trees outside. For the first time in 5 years, she felt a tiny spark of excitement hidden beneath her fear. The morning of the autumn festival brought a hard frost that turned the grass into silver needles. Mabel spent the early hours finishing her chores, ensuring the cottage stove was completely out before she began to prepare herself. She washed her face with cold water, brushed her long curls until they shone, and pinned the sides back with 2 simple wooden combs. When she pulled the blue dress over her shoulders, the soft cotton felt light against her skin. The blue ribbon looked bright against the older fabric, giving the dress a new life that made Mabel smile quietly at her reflection. She put on her winter boots, which she had cleaned with a damp cloth the night before, and walked out into the chilly afternoon air. The road leading up to the Crestmont estate was already busy with carriages and groups of townspeople walking in their best clothes. Mabel kept to the side of the path, walking beneath the heavy pine branches as the sun began to sink behind the mountains. Some of the farmers passed her, nodding kindly, while a few wealthier families looked at her dress with raised eyebrows, whispering behind their gloved hands. Mabel kept her head high, focusing on the golden lights appearing at the top of the hill. When she passed through the grand iron gates of Crestmont, she stopped in surprise. The courtyard was larger than the town square, paved with smooth dark stones that reflected the light from hundreds of paper lanterns hanging from the old oak trees. Long wooden tables were filled with large platters of roasted apples, venison, thick loaves of brown bread, and silver bowls of dark cider. A group of musicians stood near the stone fountain, playing a lively tune on fiddles and flutes. People were already dancing, their laughter rising into the cold night air like small clouds of steam. Mabel found a quiet spot near the outer stone wall, away from the center of the crowd. She held a small cup of warm cider between her hands, enjoying the warmth against her fingers as she watched the couples spin across the stones. It felt like another world, a place where the dark forest and the heavy winter did not matter. She forgot her worries for a moment, letting the music fill her mind until a loud voice broke her thoughts from just a few feet away. "I didn't think you would actually show up in that old thing," Blair said, stepping into the light of the nearest lantern. She was wearing her red silk gown, which had silver thread sewn into the sleeves, and a heavy velvet cloak around her shoulders. Her hair was styled in elaborate curls, and 3 gold rings glinted on her fingers. Her friend stood behind her, looking at Mabel with amused smiles. "It takes a lot of nerve to come to the master's house looking like you just finished scrubbing the floors," Blair added, her voice sharp enough for nearby people to hear. Mabel set her cider cup down on the stone ledge. "The invitation was for the whole town, Blair. I came to enjoy the music." Blair took a step closer, her silk skirt rustling against the stones. "The music is for everyone, but the dance is for people who belong here. You should stay in the shadows where you fit in." Before Mabel could move away, Blair reached out and caught her by the sleeve of her blue dress, her fingers tight against the cotton. "Let's make sure the master gets a good look at our town's finest worker," she whispered with a hard look. With a sudden shove, Blair pushed Mabel forward, sending her stumbling out of the shadows and directly into the clear space in the center of the courtyard. Mabel tried to catch her balance, but her boot caught on an uneven stone, and she landed on her hands and knees in front of the entire crowd. Her cider spilled across the dark pavement, and the sudden movement caused the musicians to stop playing one by one. The laughter in the courtyard died down, replaced by a heavy, uncomfortable silence as dozens of eyes turned toward the girl in the faded blue dress. Mabel felt the sting of tears in her eyes, her palms scraped against the rough stone floor. She could hear Blair laughing softly from the edge of the crowd, joined by the quiet murmurs of the townspeople who were too uncomfortable to help. She wished the dark stones would open up and take her away from the staring faces. She began to push herself up, her head lowered in shame, when a sudden freezing wind swept through the courtyard, causing the lanterns to flicker and the air to grow intensely cold in a single second. The heavy wooden doors of the main house swung open without a sound, and a tall figure stepped out onto the wide stone terrace. The crowd became completely still, some people holding their breath as Caspian walked down the wide stairs. He moved with a smooth, silent grace that did not seem human. His hair was a stark, pure white that caught the moonlight, falling neatly around a face that looked as if it had been carved from white stone. His skin was pale, showing no warmth, and his dark coat was buttoned tightly to his throat, carrying a silver crest on the collar. His eyes were dark and steady, sweeping over the courtyard until they landed on the center of the floor. He did not look at Blair in her red silk gown, nor did he look at the wealthy merchants who bowed their heads as he passed. He walked directly through the path that opened in the crowd, his boots making no sound against the pavement. He stopped right in front of Mabel, who was still kneeling on the stones, her hands trembling slightly from the cold and the embarrassment. Caspian stood over her for a brief moment, his presence large and quiet, before he slowly bent down and extended a long, pale hand toward her. "The stones are cold tonight," Caspian said, his voice low and clear, like water moving under ice. It was a calm voice, lacking the harsh edge that Mabel had expected from the stories. Mabel looked at his long fingers, then up into his face. There was no mockery in his dark eyes, no pity, only a steady, quiet interest that made the rest of the crowded courtyard seem to disappear. She hesitated for 3 seconds, then placed her small, rough hand into his wide palm. His skin was freezing like winter air, but his grip was firm and gentle as he lifted her easily to her feet. A collective whisper ran through the crowd, a rustle of heavy coats and sharp intakes of breath. Blair's face turned white, her hands clenching into tight fists against her red skirt as she watched the master of Crestmont ignore every wealthy girl in the valley for the orphan from the woods. Blair's friends stood frozen, their smiles completely gone as they realized what was happening. Even the older townspeople looked at each other in disbelief, wondering why the Vampire King would choose a girl with no name and a faded dress. Caspian did not turn to look at them. He kept his eyes on Mabel, his thumb lightly touching the blue ribbon on her sleeve. "Will you open the festival with me?" he asked, his voice steady enough for the musicians to hear. Mabel swallowed the lump in her throat, her heart beating so loud she feared he could hear it. She looked down at her worn boots, then back at his pale face. "I do not know the grand dances of the city, sir," she whispered honestly. Caspian allowed a tiny, faint smile to touch his lips. "Then we will move slowly." He signaled to the musicians with a slight nod of his head. The fiddlers picked up their instruments, playing a soft, slow melody that felt older than the trees surrounding the estate. Caspian placed one cold hand on Mabel's waist and took her right hand in his, leading her into the center of the polished floor. As they began to move, Mabel realized that she did not feel clumsy at all. Caspian guided her with such smooth certainty that her feet followed his steps without any effort, her blue dress swirling gently around her boots. The movement brought a sense of calm that Mabel had not felt in years. She forgot about Blair standing in the shadows, forgot about the whispering merchants, and forgot about the cold wind that blew through the courtyard. She looked at Caspian's white hair, noticing how the moonlight made it look like silver thread. Despite the freezing cold of his touch, she did not feel afraid. There was a strange safety in his quiet presence, a feeling that as long as he held her hand, nothing in Pine Creek could hurt her again. They moved across the stones for several minutes, the music rising and falling like the wind in the pines. Caspian watched her face, his dark eyes observing the small freckles on her nose and the quiet grace of her movements. "You dance like someone who belongs to the quiet places," he said softly as the song began to draw to a close. Mabel looked up, her cheeks slightly pink from the movement. "I spend my days by the river, sir. There is nothing loud there." The music stopped with a long, soft note from the flute, and Caspian kept his hand on hers for 2 seconds after the sound died away, bowing his head to her in respect. "Would you walk with me by the lake, Mabel?" Caspian asked, turning his back to the crowd before the next song could begin. Mabel looked back toward the tables where the townspeople were still watching them in silence, then nodded her head. "Yes, sir. I would like that." He led her down a side path made of white gravel, away from the bright paper lanterns and the loud voices of the festival. The air grew thicker with the scent of pine and wet earth as they walked deeper into the private gardens of the estate. A large, still lake sat at the bottom of the terrace, its surface perfectly black under the midnight sky, reflecting the moon like a sheet of dark glass. Caspian walked with his hands behind his back, his white hair standing out against the dark coat he wore. He did not speak for a long time, allowing the only sound to be the crunch of their boots on the gravel. Mabel felt the cold wind coming off the water, causing her to shiver slightly in her thin cotton dress. Caspian noticed the movement, stopping in his tracks to remove his heavy wool coat and place it gently over her shoulders. The coat was heavy and smelled of old paper, cedar wood, and the cold night air. It kept the wind away instantly, wrapping her in a weight that made her feel safe. "Thank you," she said, pulling the collar closer to her chin. "You must be used to the cold, living up here." Caspian looked out over the black water, his pale profile sharp against the night. "The cold does not bother me, but I forget that mortals are made of softer things. Tell me about your work by the river." Mabel was surprised that he wanted to know about something so ordinary. She sat down on a smooth stone bench near the water's edge, her hands tucked into the large pockets of his coat. "I wash the linens for the town inn and the wealthy families," she said, her voice quiet in the vast garden. "It is hard work, especially when the water freezes in December, but it keeps my cottage warm. My father used to say that honest work keeps a soul clean." Caspian turned his head to look at her, his dark eyes thoughtful. "Your father was a wise man. What happened to him?" "He died in a blizzard 5 winters ago," Mabel said, looking down at her boots. "He was helping a traveler whose wagon had broken down on the mountain pass. The river rose too fast, and he never came home. My mother followed him 2 years later. She expected him to offer the usual empty words of sympathy that she heard from the townspeople, but Caspian simply remained silent, listening to her words with a deep gravity that felt more respectful than any practiced phrase. "I know what it is to lose a family," Caspian said after a long pause, his voice dropping into a deeper tone. "I have lived on this hill for more than 100 years, watching the town change, watching families grow and fade away like summer grass. People fear me because I do not change, because my blood is cold and my days are spent in the dark. But the silence of this house can be heavier than the stone walls." Mabel looked at his pale hands, realizing that beneath the title of Vampire King, he was just as lonely as she was in her empty cottage. Before she could answer, the sound of heavy footsteps on the gravel broke the quiet of the garden. Garrison, the older estate manager, stepped into the light of the moon, his face set in a hard, serious line. He looked at Mabel with a sharp, disapproving gaze before turning to Caspian. "Sir, the elders from the neighboring valley have arrived. They are waiting in the great hall for your counsel. It is not wise to keep them waiting for a girl from the village." The tone of his voice made it clear that he did not think Mabel belonged anywhere near the master of the house. Mabel stood up immediately, slipping Caspian's heavy coat from her shoulders and handing it back to him. "Your manager is right, sir. You have important guests, and I should return to the town before the path gets too dark." Caspian took the coat, his fingers brushing hers for a fraction of a second, his dark eyes narrowing slightly as he looked at Garrison. "Go safely, Mabel," he said softly, ignoring his manager's presence. Mabel turned and walked quickly down the gravel path, the cold wind catching her dress as she left the quiet lake behind. By the next morning, the story of the dance had spread to every corner of Pine Creek. The women talking at the well, the men gathering at the blacksmith shop, and the children playing in the dirt lanes spoke of nothing else. Mabel tried to ignore the stares as she walked to the bakery at 7 o'clock to buy a single loaf of bread. People who had not spoken to her in years now nodded their heads and offered polite smiles, while others watched her from behind their curtains with expressions of deep curiosity. Blair was furious. She spent the 3 days following the festival inside her father's large house, refusing to see her friends or walk down the main street. When she finally came out, her eyes were cold and her mouth was set in a tight, bitter line. She began to visit the shops along the square, dropping quiet, poisonous remarks about how Mabel must have used some strange herb or old trick to catch the master's eye. She whispered to the innkeeper that a poor girl who was desperate for money would do anything to escape her laundry tubs, suggesting that Mabel was dangerous and untrustworthy. Mabel kept her head down, focusing on her work, but the rumors began to take a toll. Two of the wealthier families canceled their laundry orders without explanation, leaving her with fewer coins at the end of the week. She sat by her small wood stove on Thursday evening, counting the 5 copper pieces left in her jar, wondering how she would pay for her winter flour if more people stopped using her services. The fear of the coming cold began to press heavily against her chest once again. The next afternoon, Mabel was down at her usual spot by the river, her arms deep in soapy water as she scrubbed a thick wool blanket. She heard a soft rustle in the dry ferns behind her and turned around, expecting to see Blair or one of her friends. Instead, she found Caspian standing at the edge of the trees. He was wearing a simple dark cloak, his white hair partially covered by a hood, his pale skin bright against the green pine needles. He looked entirely out of place in the wild woods, yet he stood with the same calm grace he held in his ballroom. "You are far from your hill, sir," Mabel said, wiping her brow with the back of her wet arm. Caspian walked down to the gravel bank, stopping 2 feet away from her water tub. "The house was too quiet today," he said, looking at the heavy blanket she was lifting. "And I wanted to see if you were still dancing with the river." Mabel let out a small, tired laugh, setting the wet wool down. "The river is a much harder partner than you were, sir. It does not move when I ask it to." Caspian sat down on a large fallen log near her workspace, pulled a small leather-bound book from his cloak, and held it out to her. "I brought you this. It has stories of the southern lands where the winter never comes. I thought it might keep you warm during the long nights." Mabel took the book with careful fingers, her thumb running over the smooth leather cover. "Thank you," she said softly, her heart warming at the thoughtful gesture. "No one has given me a book since my mother passed away." He stayed for 2 hours, sitting on the old log while she finished her work. He did not speak much, but he listened whenever she talked about the different birders that came to the river, or the way the leaves changed color in the valley. He told her small details about the history of the mountains, speaking of events that had happened 80 years ago, as if they were yesterday. Mabel realized that the coldness people feared in him was just a shield. Beneath it, he possessed a deep, patient kindness that made her seen in a way she had never experienced before. When the sun began to drop behind the pines, casting long shadows over the water, Mabel loaded her damp blankets into her wicker basket. Caspian stood up, his tall figure blocking the fading light. "The townspeople are talking about us, Mabel," he said quietly. Mabel looked down at the gravel, her fingers tightening on the basket handles. "I know. Some of them have stopped giving me work because of it. They think I am looking for things I do not deserve." Caspian took a step closer, his dark eyes steady. "You deserve more than this river can give you, Mabel. Do not let their fear change your heart." The weather changed drastically on Tuesday night, bringing a cold, heavy rain that turned the dirt roads of Pine Creek into thick mud. Mabel stayed inside her cottage, the small wood stove crackling as the water beat hard against the wooden shingles of her roof. She sat under her mother's old patchwork quilt, reading the leather book Caspian had given her by the light of a small tallow candle. The stories of warm shores and endless green fields felt like a beautiful dream, but the sound of the rain kept reminding her of the hard reality waiting outside her door. A sudden, loud knock shook the heavy wooden door, making Mabel jump from her stool. She set the book down with care and walked over to the entrance, pulling the iron latch back with a hesitant hand. She expected to see a traveler lost in the storm, but when the door swung open, she found Caspian standing on the small porch. His white hair was wet from the storm, clingy against his pale forehead, and his dark cloak was soaked through. Behind him, holding a large oil lantern under a wide umbrella, stood Garrison, the estate manager, his face grimmer than usual. "May we come in, Mabel?" Caspian asked, his voice low against the sound of the thunder. Mabel stepped aside immediately, opening the door wider to let them into the small, warm room. "Yes, please. It is a terrible night to be out on the mountain road." Caspian walked into the center of the cottage, his eyes taking in the simple wooden table, the 2 chairs, and the small iron pot heating over the fire. He looked like a king standing in a peasant's hut. Yet he moved without any sign of discomfort. Garrison closed the door behind them, setting his lantern down on the table. He did not look at the small room with his usual scorn. Instead, his old eyes were fixed on Mabel, with an expression that looked like a mixture of pain and deep regret. He pulled a small, dark wooden box from beneath his wet coat and placed it gently next to the lantern. "I have something that belongs to your family, young lady," the old manager said, his voice cracking slightly as he spoke. Mabel walked over to the table, looking from the old man to Caspian, who stood silently by the wood stove. "What is it?" she asked softly. Garrison reached out with a trembling hand and opened the lid of the box. Inside, resting on a piece of faded green velvet, lay a heavy silver pocket watch and a small silver medal with an anchor engraved on the front. Mabel's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the medal immediately. It was the piece her father had worn every single day of his life, until the night he disappeared into the mountain river. "Your father did not die alone that night, Mabel," Garrison said, his head lowering as he stared at the silver medal. "He died saving me. My wagon had overturned in the freezing creek, and my legs were pinned beneath the heavy timbers. The water was rising fast, and everyone else had fled into the woods. Your father stayed. He pulled me out of the wreckage and dragged me to the safety of the high bank. But before he could climb up himself, a second wave of ice and logs took him down the river." Mabel felt the tears spilling over her eyelashes, her hands flying to her mouth to stifle a sob. "He saved you," she whispered. Garrison nodded, a single tear running down his wrinkled cheek. "He gave me his medal before he jumped back into the current to look for his horse, telling me to keep it safe. I was a proud man, Mabel. I was ashamed that a poor woodcutter had to give his life for mine, so I hid the box in the estate vault and tried to forget that night ever happened. I watched you struggle in poverty for 5 years, and I did nothing because of my foolish pride." Caspian stepped forward, placing a pale, steady hand on Garrison's shoulder before looking at Mabel. "Garrison told me the truth this morning, Mabel. I brought him here tonight so he could right his wrong. The Crestmont estate owes its survival to your father's brave heart, and we will not allow his daughter to live in the shadows any longer." Mabel looked at the silver medal, then at the 2 men standing in her small cottage, realizing that the hole in her heart was finally beginning to heal with the truth. The rain passed by Friday morning, leaving the valley of Pine Creek crisp, clean, and filled with the scent of wet earth and autumn pine. The news of Garrison's confession traveled through the town even faster than the rumors of the dance, changing the way people spoke Mabel's name forever. The families who had canceled their laundry orders came to her door with baskets of fresh apples, warm bread, and sincere apologies, their faces red with the shame of how they had treated her. Mabel accepted their words with her usual quiet grace, holding no bitterness in her heart. Blair could not face the town after the truth came to light. The realization that Mabel's family was honored by the grand estate on the hill, while her own father's wealth could not buy the master's respect, was too much for her pride to bear. Within 2 weeks, her father sold their large white house with the 3 chimneys and moved the family down to a larger city near the coast. The town square felt quieter without her sharp remarks and loud laughter, and the local girls began to look at Mabel not with envy, but with a new sense of respect. With the financial help that Garrison provided to honor her father's sacrifice, Mabel did not have to spend her days at the freezing river anymore. She used the silver coins to repair the leaky roof of her cottage, buy a steady supply of firewood for the winter, and purchase several bolts of fine wool and silk from the merchants. She opened a small sewing shop near the town square, using the skills her mother had taught her to create beautiful, simple dresses for the women of the valley. Her business grew quickly, because she treated every customer with the same kindness, whether they had a gold coin or a basket of potatoes. Caspian continued to visit her, no longer hiding his presence from the town. He would walk down from the hill at 6 o'clock every Tuesday and Thursday evening, stopping by her shop just as she was closing the wooden shutters. They would walk together through the quiet streets, his white hair catching the glow of the street lamps, his pale face calm and content as he listened to her talk about her day. The townspeople grew used to the sight of the vampire king walking beside the seamstress, realizing that true nobility had nothing to do with the warmth of one's blood. 1 year after the dance that changed everything, the gates of Crestmont opened once again for the autumn festival. The courtyard was even grander than before, filled with more lanterns, louder music, and a sense of genuine joy that filled the cold night air. The entire town gathered around the stone fountain, their faces bright with cider and laughter, as they waited for the master of the house to appear. Mabel stood near the center of the floor, wearing a beautiful light blue silk dress that she had made herself, inspired by her mother's old gown, but finished with fine lace and bright silver ribbons. Caspian walked down the wide stone steps, his dark eyes fixing on Mabel the moment he stepped into the light. He walked through the crowd, which now stood in silent respect, and stopped right in front of her, extending his pale hand with a deep bow. "Will you dance with me again, Mabel?" he asked, his low voice carrying across the quiet courtyard. Mabel smiled, her fingers sliding into his freezing palm with complete trust. "Always, sir," she whispered, as the musicians began to play the familiar old folk song. They moved across the dark stones with a perfect, shared rhythm, their movements smooth and effortless under the midnight stars. When the song ended, Caspian did not let go of her hand. Instead, he stepped back and slowly sank onto one knee before her, pulling a small silver ring with a blue sapphire stone from his pocket. The courtyard became completely still, the only sound being the wind rustling through the old oak trees as everyone waited for his words. "I have lived in the dark for more than a century, Mabel," Caspian said, looking up into her face with a steady, quiet devotion. "But you brought the light back into my house with your gentle heart and your honest soul. Will you do me the honor of becoming my queen and sharing this hill with me for the rest of your days?" Mabel felt the tears of happiness rising in her eyes, a wide smile breaking across her face as she looked at the white-haired man who had saved her from the cold. "Yes, Caspian," she said clearly, her voice echoing through the valley. "I will." The golden light of the early morning sun began to creep over the peaks of the mountains, casting long, warm shadows across the wooden floor of the great library at Crestmont. Mabel stood by the tall glass window, holding a warm cup of herbal tea between her palms as she watched the mist slowly rise from the black surface of the lake below. The silver ring on her finger caught the pale light, reflecting tiny blue sparks against the dark wood of the window frame. It was quiet in the grand house, a peaceful, heavy stillness that no longer felt lonely or cold, but wrapped around the rooms like a comfortable winter blanket. She thought about the path that had brought her to this high hill, remembering the freezing river water, the heavy baskets of laundry, and the sharp words that used to make her head bow in shame. Those days felt distant now, like a story told about someone else. Yet she knew she would never let the comfort of her new life erase the lessons she had learned in the valley. She understood that the hardships had not broken her, but had taught her how to value the simple truth of a good heart above the temporary glitter of wealth or social standing. Looking out over the small town of Pine Creek, where the first chimneys were beginning to send thin trails of smoke into the clear air, Mabel felt a deep sense of peace about the years waiting ahead. She knew that winters would still come, that the mountain winds would still blow cold, and that life would always bring its own storms. But she also knew that as long as she stayed true to the kindness her parents had taught her, and as long as she had Caspian's steady hand to hold in the dark, there was no winter long enough to put out the warmth they had found together.